Back when I first started doing videos for the Moto Trek channel, I had mentioned in the comments of one of the videos how I had ended up with a Harley-Davidson Pan America and that I had traded in a BMW for it. And it generated a lot of discussion and a lot of very, sometimes hostile comments, mostly from brand loyalists one way or the other, but I kind of thought I had explained it pretty well, but apparently not. And so I wanted to make this video to let everybody know exactly how this whole thing transpired and tell the story. So a little bit of background about me and my motorcycles. I have to love a bike to keep it or to buy it in the first place. The bike has to move my soul, okay? I have to really, really like the bike, and I have a bunch of bikes in the garage that I really, really like. So I had a 2015 BMW R1200 GSA. That's a key thing, 2015. And I had been riding it for, at this point, more than 8 years. And that bike had been all over the country and in other countries, and I'd done a lot of stuff on that bike. I used to use it as a training bike as well, because I always felt that I would rather train on my bike that's set up for me rather than just borrowing a fleet bike. This is back when I worked at Rawhide. And so that bike went through a lot of good stuff, a lot of good times, a lot of work. And towards the beginning of 2021, we also had a deal going with Harley-Davidson to introduce the new Pan America. And I was a lead instructor for that project. And I had a bike that had, I think it had like 12 miles on it. It was a pre-production bike, or as Paul James would say, it's a pre-production bike. It was really that early on in the development of the bike. And there was about 5 of those, along with a fleet of about 30 pre-production Pan Americas that we used all through 21 to train people on. And I ended up falling in love with the bike because there was a few standout things about this bike that just really got me and really moved my soul. So one of the first things that I fell in love with about the Pan America was the motor. And I had been riding it around for about a week with a bunch of Harley-Davidson people and sort of getting used to it and never really wringing it out that much until the first opportunity I had to ride it without the prying eyes of the corporate world on me. I crept up to Highway 14 in California City and just waited until there was almost no traffic. I put the bike in sport mode, and when it was clear, I pinned it and took off. And what I noticed was right as I hit third gear and looked down at the speedo, it was 109. So right away, I was super impressed with the power and speed of this bike. The BMW wasn't bad, but not like that, right? So that was super impressive. And the thing about my BMW, and the reason that I kind of emphasized it was a 2015, was that my bike didn't have all the modern stuff that almost all the premium bikes have now. So I didn't have a 6-axis IMU. I didn't have lean angle ABS. I didn't have any of that kind of stuff. Then after riding this and realizing how good that stuff was, I started thinking about, I'd like to own one of these. I really would. So my BMW, again, being a 2015, didn't have all the modern rider aids that all of the modern bikes seem to have now, the Bosch systems. Right? So it didn't have a 6-axis IMU, it didn't have lean angle sensitive ABS, any of that kind of stuff. And I really started to appreciate that stuff because it worked really well on the Pan America. And at the same time, my GSA was starting to get a little tired. It was over 80,000 miles. And because of the stuff that I had used it for, I had already had to replace the front shock. I had around 45,000 miles, had to replace the clutch because I use it as a training bike and I'm, demonstrating friction zone all the time and stuff like that, right? But at some point, it also started to have these little failures. Like I needed to replace a throttle body for some odd reason, and I was starting to get an indication that possibly one of the engine wiring harnesses was getting dried out and cracked. And so I knew, and also based on the advice of my mechanic, that it was probably time to start thinking about my next bike. Well, the timing was really good because as I was thinking about replacing my GSA, I started to get involved with this whole project with Harley-Davidson. And again, going back to my bike being a 2015, this, or the one that I was riding then, my coaching bike, was far superior to my 2015 GSA. So I want to make that clear. It's not that I'm saying the Pan America is better than the GS. What I'm saying is the bike that I was riding was leaps and bounds ahead of the bike that I owned at the time. Okay, so I think this is the distinction where I got most of the weird comments online. And so I want to make sure people understand that. I'm not saying one is better than the other, okay? I'm saying that this bike and this current bike that I own, this 22, was far superior to my 2015 BMW GSA. So let's get that out of the way first. Then let's talk about this bike and why I love it so much. The first thing that struck me about the Pan America was the motor. It's absolutely glorious. This thing's got a lot of power. And when you put this bike in sport mode, it literally is a sport bike. The suspension stiffens up to its stiffest setting, and the throttle response is maximized, and so is the engine output. So you're getting that full 150 horsepower. The BMW, it had plenty of power, but not this much power. So right away, it was like one of those things that give you a thrill, and so I was thrilled with the bike. The BMW though, it's a great motor, and there's a reason that BMW always wins all of the shootouts among the big adventure bikes, and it's because of their boxer motor. It's a great design. It's got a low center of gravity, it has very smooth torque delivery, and it has more low-end torque than any other type of engine design, simply because it's a boxer engine. Okay, so there's no getting around that. But this bike also has plenty of torque and plenty of low-end torque, so it's almost as good as what I was riding. At the top end, it was better, by far. All right, another thing that I really like about this bike compared to what I was riding. So let me just talk just for a second about BMW's telelever system. They've used it for over 40 years. It's genius. It's a great mechanical anti-dive system, and it keeps the front end very precise all the time. But one little niggly problem that I had with it is because it's a anti-dive system, when you're riding in deep sand, it's a little trickier on a BMW, because instead of just allowing the wheel to sort of roll over tufts of sand, it tends to make it want to push through them a little bit. So it's a little trickier to ride in sand. And because I'm from Southern California and I ride in the desert, I'm riding in sand a lot. So I like the way that this bike felt in the sand. It was, for me anyway, a lot easier to ride in deep sand. I was also the first one to ride a Pan America to the Husky Monument, and it was not difficult. And I know that going out there on a BMW was tricky. And I was out there with some people on a BMW, and they're like, it doesn't look like it's hard for you. I'm like, well, it's not, right? So that was one thing that I also appreciated about this bike. So at this point, I'm thinking that a Pan America is going to be, for me, the perfect replacement for my GSA, which is now aging. So I wanted to buy the bike that I was coaching on. No one else had ridden it. I was the only one to sit on that bike. And it had about 5,000, 6,000 miles on it towards the end of that program in 2021. And I'll tell you more about that program, which was also cool. But I wanted to buy that bike that I was coaching on, and they said no. And I said, well, okay, well, why not? And the reason was that it was a pre-production bike that would have just too much liability if they let somebody from the public own it. So I still tried. I kept asking. I was being kind of a pain about it, because it just didn't make any sense to me why I couldn't own that bike. And then they said, well, it's also, all of the coaching bikes that we had were European spec, which also made them unavailable for sale in the US. And so then my solution was, how about this? How about if we completely disassemble the bike, and I'll buy every one of the parts from you and I'll put it back together? Now I thought I had something, right? And so now the answer was still no. And so I wasn't allowed to buy the bike. And those bikes, all 30 of those bikes at the end of the program in 2021 were destroyed. So it was a bummer for me, and I was still riding my GSA, which was okay. And I just decided I was gonna wait until the time was right to see if I could get a deal on a Pan America. Now, at the time, I was also the chief instructor at Bartell's Harley-Davidson Riding Academy in Marina del Rey. And I would always walk past the Pan Americas as I walked upstairs to the classroom to teach a class. And I would see them coming and going and getting sold, and new ones coming in. And at one point, they had 3 2022s on the showroom floor. And this was late in the year. And then early the next year, there was still a couple of the 2022s there. And I looked at them, and I watched them mark the price down a little bit. And then at one point in August of 2022, there was a program that hardly anyone knew about. And it was something that Harley-Davidson did to try and clear the old inventory off the floor. And so during August of 2023, if you could find a 22 that was still on the showroom floor and you bought it, you got $2,500 worth of parts and accessories credit. And so it was a 30-day window, and I thought, okay, the time is right. I'm gonna strike while the iron's hot. And so not only did I get a great deal on the bike, and probably a better deal because I actually worked there, they also gave me a really, really good trade-in for my GSA. So it was a no-brainer. And I ended up trading in the GSA and getting this. So that's kind of the story about how all this happened. But I'd also like to mention here some of the really cool features of this bike. All right, so some of the cool features about this bike I learned about during that period of time in 2021 when we had people coming from all over the world to come and experience the bike, right? And part of that experience for them was at the end of the first day sitting through an engineering presentation, mostly about this motor. So this motor has some features that make it extremely cool. One of those features is constantly variable valve timing, which gives the bike, first of all, it's full 150 horsepower, but it also gives it a torque band that instead of just climbing up and peaking, climbs up and stays flat for a long time. So it's got a really, really wide power band and very, very good torque delivery in all parts of the rev range. So that was one thing that was very cool about this bike too. And it felt really good and easy to manage off-road. Another thing, this bike has 3 different balance shafts inside, and they're all a different size and shape. And the original design of the motor was so well balanced that it had almost no vibration whatsoever, which would have been cool for a lot of people. But this being a Harley-Davidson and a V-twin, the engineers decided that they wanted to make it feel more alive, and so they simply changed one of the balance shafts to give the bike a little bit more character and a little bit of vibration, like you would expect from a Harley-Davidson. So that was kind of interesting that they did that for, you know, to please the customer, right? And it does feel really good. There's a few other things too. This is the first time Harley-Davidson has ever had an integrated engine and transmission all in one casting. So that was a new thing for them, and it made the bike a lot lighter than it normally would have been. This is also the engine is now the stressed member of the frame. So essentially the engine on this bike is the frame. And then there's a subframe that bolts to the front to hold the front end and all of that. And this one on the rear to hold all of that, right? But the engine here is actually the biggest part of the frame. That also allowed them to drop the motor down really low so that this bike also has a nice low center of gravity. Maybe not quite as low as a BMW, but lower than a lot of other bikes that I've ridden. Some of the super tall bikes, the KTM 1190s and all that, they feel like super top heavy. Even the Africa Twin does. And this bike doesn't, right? So that was another thing that impressed me. I was also impressed by the design of these stock engine guards that come with the Pan America, or they come with the special, and you know, if you get that version. I thought this bike would be similar to some other bikes like the Africa Twin. That would be, once it falls over, it was just gonna be a bear to get this thing back up off the ground. And what I discovered early on was that it's not difficult to lift. These engine guards don't look like they stick out that far, but they kind of do a similar thing that the engine guards on a BMW do, where the bike just doesn't fall all the way over. So in the case of the Pan America, it might fall flat, but it'll immediately rock back onto the tires, and you've got that head start. Because anybody that's lifted a large adventure bike knows that that first 8 or 9 inches is where the difficulty is. And so this eliminates that. So while we're on the subject of picking the bike up, one thing that also impressed me quite a bit during that year in 2021 was the durability of this bike. Because when you take a bike and you put it in the hands of someone that's never ridden off-road and you train them and you take them on a ride, they're gonna get dropped. And they're gonna get dropped a lot. And these bikes never seem to suffer from being dropped, right? They just took it and kept going. We might have had some scrapes here or whatever, but it wasn't like things were breaking on the bike. And you can't say that about a lot of bikes. I mean, even some of the smaller BMWs that I've ridden or trained with seemed like every time the bike fell over, something got broken, right? Some bikes have a lot of plastics up here that get broken, but these bikes, even a bike that was technically totaled, was still in perfectly rideable condition at one point, right? Somebody had slammed it into a rock wall on a ride on the highway. But I was super impressed with the durability of the bike as well. So again, now it's starting to look like it could be a good replacement for my aging BMW. Okay, so the suspension of this bike, how did it stack up against my 2015 GSA? My GSA had what they call ESA, which is electronic suspension adjustment. And so it would change with ride modes, right? And it had a firm and a medium and a soft. This bike also has a very similar system, right? But with a couple of extra things added. So the modern BMWs have automatic preload, and so does this bike. And that's a game changer, right? I can load this bike up with however much stuff I want to carry. I don't have to adjust the preload. So on my GSA 2015, I would have to make an adjustment. I would have to go into the menus and set it for either, a single rider or two up or rider with luggage or whatever. And it never seemed to be exactly where I needed it to be. Because honestly, what you're looking for is 30% sag on your suspension so that everything operates the way it's designed to. And I could never really hit the sweet spot on my GSA. I could get close. This bike, and all the modern BMWs as well, have this automatic preload that just makes it a non-issue now. You can load the bike up, it'll always just find that sweet spot at 30% sag. So that was another bonus for this bike compared to what I was riding. The suspension settings, as you change ride modes, are also really good on this bike. And it has, I think it has one extra mode besides the 3 that I had on my 2015 GSA. So this has a comfort setting, an off-road soft, a road setting, a sport setting, and they all change, and they're all very well engineered. And so are the ride modes. This bike has, especially the standard off-road ride mode is amazing on this bike. I didn't really have all of that fancy stuff on my 2015 GSA. So again, this is another thing that impressed me about this bike. The off-road mode on this bike is built and engineered so that a new rider, a new off-road rider, can still have a really good time on this bike. Can spin the back wheel a little bit. Unlike the BMWs where you have enduro mode where it tries to limit your wheel spin as much as possible. This one will let you spin that rear wheel, but only so much, right? Only about twice the speed of the front wheel. And so a new rider could be completely ham-fisted on the throttle in this mode, and it would probably be okay. You could come out of a turn, spinning the wheel, and the bike would just line itself up and keep going. Right? And you still had, in that mode, you still have all of your rider aids, all your lean angle ABS and all of that. Traction control is still there. It's reduced to the rear wheel, but it's still there. ABS is still on the front wheel. When you switch this bike into Off-Road Plus, the traction control is almost all the way gone at the rear wheel. The lean angle sensitive rider aids go away. And now it's more of a purist bike, and you kind of need to know what you're doing to ride it in that mode. If you want the traction control all the way off, there's a button on the handlebar. You can just do that. You can just turn it all the way off. So the ride modes were way superior to the ride modes that I was used to on my 2015 GSA. And from what I understand, the newer BMWs are also comparable to this. But again, I was coming from a 8-year-old, 9-year-old bike to this brand new, fantastic machine. And so it was impressive. And I wanted to ride this. I wanted to own this bike. All right, now I want to talk about reliability. Okay, this is a big deal, especially with this bike and all the things that we've learned about it online. My personal philosophy about buying a motorcycle is when there's a new model introduced, I would never buy the first one. And unfortunately, the Pan America suffered in the first model year, which was 2021. But it's not a Harley-Davidson issue. Right? This is with all bikes. BMW is going through the same thing right now with the introduction of the new R1200 GS and GSA. It's a new model and it's a complete redesign. And so there's a lot of bugs that they have to work out, and they have the same type of customer complaints as Harley-Davidson did the first year of this bike. So that's not a brand specific thing. And again, I always advise people to wait until the second model year or later to buy something, which is what I did, right? And so I would never buy the first model year BMW, and I knew better than to buy the first model year of the Pan America as well. So my personal experience with this bike, it has been rock solid. The only thing that has ever happened on this bike is I managed to, riding it pretty hard on about 50 something miles of washboard road, I blew out the rear shock, but it was replaced under warranty. And everything else has been fine. I haven't had any of the problems that you hear about online. And I think part of the problem with that is the people that have those problems are usually the loudest. And it sort of gives the perception that the bike isn't reliable, right? You hardly ever hear from someone that hasn't had any problems. So I want to make sure that people do hear from me and that I really haven't had any problems, right? I was the one that blew that rear shock by going 55, 60 miles on a dirt washboard road, on the worst washboard road I've ever ridden on, right? That was me. The rest of the bike is fine. It's done wonderful things for me. It's never failed to take me where I'm going. It doesn't have any issues that bother me, really. It's a good, solid bike. So was my GSA, right? So this transition from my older GSA to this newer Pan America isn't me saying, oh, I don't like BMW anymore. I still have 3 BMWs in the garage and I love them and I always will. And I'll probably end up with another GS at some point. But right now, this is my bike. And I love this bike, and I don't have any serious complaints about it. But I also don't want to give you the impression that any bike is perfect, including this one. I do have some things that I wish were different about this bike. So the first thing is the adaptive ride height. This was actually the first adventure bike to have something like that. And of course, BMW followed very quickly after that. But this was the first one, and it's an ingenious system. It's sort of semi-passive. So it uses valving in the suspension to lower the bike as you come to a stop, and then when you take off again, the suspension movement is what actually pumps it back up, right? So there's no pumps or motors or anything like that. But in retrospect, I should have purchased a bike that didn't have it, simply because I'm tall enough to not need it, right? So it was a great idea. It opened up the availability of the big adventure bike to riders that aren't quite as tall as everybody else. So that was great. I just didn't need it. And it does have like an issue with the side stand. And again, BMW has a similar feature and they have the same issue, right? So the side stand is, it's hard for it to be the correct length depending on where the suspension is, right? So I've actually changed mine. When I bought my bike, it came with the longer version of the side stand, and I had to learn some tips and tricks to make it not so much of a pain in the butt when I came to a stop to get the side stand down. And then shortly after that, they introduced a side stand that was the correct length for the adaptive ride height version bikes. And now I don't really have a problem. But on any of these bikes, BMW or Harley-Davidson, that have this feature, this adaptive ride height, you have to pay close attention to where you're parking, because sometimes it's going to be leaning too far and sometimes it's not leaning far enough. And so you have to understand how to, like, if you think it's in an awkward position, okay, how do I make the suspension either drop or raise up so that I can park safely? So again, it's a neat feature, but my suggestion is if you don't need it, don't buy it, and you'll save 1,500 bucks. So another thing that's not quite perfect about the Pan America is some of the design features of the front end, okay? And I'm not talking about the suspension here. The original fender was very short, and the radiator is right there, and a lot of stuff got flung onto the radiator. So I added a fender extender to mine and solved that problem. But the other issue is that right up here, I know it's hard for you to see this, but right up here behind the horn is the air intake. So the air box is under the tank, and the air intake points downward at an angle. It's just like a snorkel. And the problem with that is, most of the time it's not a problem, but if you charge through a water crossing too fast on this bike and create that big bow wake that we all love to see pictures of, a bunch of water goes up into the air filter, and not necessarily into the engine, but into the air box. And it's like, creates a puddle in there. And it's kind of an odd thing. So I actually, for a while, I had a waterproof pre-filter that I slipped over the end of the snorkel to keep that from happening. But then the problem with that was that it would get caked up with dust and stuff like that, and I'd have to take it off and rinse it off. And to get at it, you have to pull the tank and pull the air box. So a little too much hassle. It's just easier to learn to be careful going through a water crossing. All right, another thing that is worth talking about is the battery placement on this bike. I was really concerned with it being as low as it is. It's down here, right, under the skid plate, And I thought it was just going to be a problem if you submerged it. It's really not, right? Batteries are sealed, and it's an AGM battery, which is the correct application for this bike because it's much more resistant to heat, vibration, all that kind of stuff, right? But if you do need to jump start the bike, it's really hard to get to, especially if you've got any kind of aftermarket skid plate. So some people have solved this issue by carrying a jump starter, but having a pigtail that they bought from like Noco or whoever makes their jump starter that's just permanently attached to the bike and maybe zip tied up here onto the crash bar so they can get to it easy. So why do I even mention that you might need to jump start the bike? Well, on the first few years of this bike, the battery was pretty small. And if you did things like just turned on the ignition and let it sit there, it was easy to get the battery to a point where it didn't have enough power to start the bike. Now, this has all been solved in the 24 and later models. The battery is bigger, the stator is bigger, the entire charging system is much more reliable now. But I have this, and honestly, I haven't had problems with it. And one reason is because when I park this bike in my garage, I immediately plug it into a tender. So my battery's in good shape and it's not a problem. But for people that don't do that or can't, let's say they don't have electricity where they park the bike, they started to have problems with the size of the battery, the actual capacity. So Harley addressed that, and now the battery is bigger and so is the charging system. So another complaint that some owners had in the early few years of the Pan America was that the catalytic converter is right there next to your right foot, and it throws off a lot of heat. Any catalytic converter does. It's not like this one is hotter than any other, but just because of where it is, it was uncomfortable for a lot of people. So in 2023, Harley-Davidson now started adding a stainless steel heat shield above the catalytic converter to sort of mitigate that problem. So one of the first things that I did when I bought this bike was I ordered that same heat shield from a 23 to put on my 22, and it's down there now, and I don't have a problem now. However, some riders still do have a problem, but it's typically somebody that's like going for a ride downtown wearing sneakers and slacks, which I wouldn't recommend you ever do on a motorcycle in the first place. But having good boots will solve that problem. So right now, the way as it sits, I do not have a heat issue at all with this bike. So another heat issue that some people have is the fan that's on the left side of the bike. When it would kick on and blow air backwards, it would blow right onto the rider's leg, and it was also really hot. In 2023, Harley-Davidson introduced a deflector on this side so that the air would blow outwards, away from the rider. And I also purchased that part. It was cheap, $36 or something like that, and I put it on my 22, and it works wonders. There are some aftermarket ones available that go over the fan housing, but in my experience with other people that own this bike, those are too restrictive, and the engine temperature started to climb up. So I just thought, well, the one that Harley introduced is nowhere near the actual fan housing. It just redirects the air outwards. And it was cheaper. So I just went with that, and it works great. And I don't have any problem with engine temperature or anything like that. I don't have heat on my leg. Another issue that I've always had with big adventure bikes is the windscreen. So on my 2015 GSA, anybody that's ridden or owned one of those bikes knows that that windscreen's pretty big. It's like a big billboard, right? And I hated it. Not because it didn't work, but because it was sort of floppy. The first ones were kind of weak, and it created this buffeting against the top of my head that I just couldn't stand, right? No matter what position I put it in, there was always buffeting like right there, okay? So after trying several different windscreens on my GSA, I finally went to no windscreen, and I bought a little sport fairing from Machine Art Moto, and it worked wonders for me because for me, at 6 feet tall, the steady air in my face was much nicer than the buffeting. So when I bought the Pan America, the first thing I noticed was that the stock windscreen was actually very good. I was impressed with it, and I could make a difference raising or lowering it. But I still had, at highway speeds, a small amount of buffeting. And so knowing that I'm going to ride sometimes very long distances on the highway as well, not just off-road, I wanted to be rid of that buffeting. And so I ended up doing a similar thing on my Pan America with a sport screen from Wunderlich. And this does the same thing for me. It allows me to have a little bit of protection, but I get a nice steady blast of air to my helmet, which for me is much better than the buffeting. That's my opinion and the way I like to ride. So here's a funny story about how I got some of the accessories on this bike. When what they called the Pan America experience in 2021, when that came to an end, we knew that all 30 of these bikes were going to be destroyed, and it was kind of a bummer. And so I had the very last group of riders that I was leading through the desert and brought them back, and I saw that truck sitting there knowing, okay, these bikes are going to get loaded up and that's it for them. And so as I rolled up, they were asking people to park near the truck so that they could load these bikes up. And I kind of rolled up really slowly to one of the executives that was directing us and hit the gas. And as I went past him, I said, "I'll be right back." And so it was like a swan song for me and my coaching bike. I just went out in the desert and rode the crap out of it. Rode it like I stole it, right? I was just pinning the throttle, redlining the engine, just having a blast, throwing roost all day long. I was gone for about, 45 minutes, an hour, and I came back to the truck. And this gentleman was still standing there and said, "Oh, you shouldn't have taken off so quick." He goes, "By the way, there's a toolbox sitting right there by the truck. And, sometimes things go missing, right?" Now, this gentleman's no longer with Harley-Davidson, so he's not gonna get in trouble. That's the only reason I'm telling you this. But I understood clearly what he meant. And so as quickly as I could, I took things like the luggage and the aux lights and stuff like that, a spare set of mirrors, anything that I could quickly remove from the bike, and put them in my truck and stored them in my garage for 2 years until it was time for me to actually purchase a Pan America. So that's kind of a funny story about how I got the aux lights and some of the luggage stuff that I still have, the soft luggage. I don't use that. I've switched to Moscow now, but it's kind of a funny story that I thought you'd enjoy. The bottom line here, and the reason that I'm making this video, is that there were a lot of strange comments when I explained that I had traded in a BMW for a Harley-Davidson. So I want to be very clear about this. The Harley-Davidson Pan America 1250 Special is far superior to the 2015 BMW GSA that I was riding. I'm not trying to say that one brand is better than the other. I like them both. I love them both, actually. So that's how I ended up with this, and that's why I made the video. Hopefully this clears up any misconceptions anyone might have about how I ended up with this bike. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.